On this week's episode of Where We Are, the New York Times thinks Christianity has a brand problem. We'll discuss it. We'll also talk about Mother's Day and Melissa's thoughts on mothering. You're listening to Where We Are.
Hello, Where We Are listeners. If you're a longtime fan of this podcast or you're just joining us for the first time today, we want to tell you more about our podcast platform called Spotify for Podcasters. We've been using this platform for over a year, and it's been easy to use, and new features are added all the time. You can record and edit podcasts from your phone or computer. You don't need anything fancy, and you don't need previous podcast experience. When you hit publish, you will distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify if that's your kind of thing. And with Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. But here's the thing, you can earn money, but it's a free platform. There's no catch. If you're curious or want to see what it's all about, download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
This is Where We Are. We are the Wares. I'm Michael.
I'm Melissa.
Happy Mother's Day, Melissa.
Thank you.
It's a big day.
Yes.
We're going out for brunch.
Yeah, going out for a brunch with our gals.
And then you're being sent off, free range.
Yeah, get to be alone. My thoughts.
It's terrifying. So, I don't even need to know what you're doing. You can do whatever you want to do.
I'm going to a cat cafe. I'm going to get a coffee and go to a cat cafe and be surrounded by cats.
Okay, I wish I didn't know what you were doing. But, whatever fills your cup.
Yeah.
Or fills your milk bowl to continue with the cat.
Yeah.
Cat talk, yeah. All right, we got interesting episode. We had an interview set up, but our guest, who I'm very excited about, had some technical issues. Should be all set to have. Actually, why don't we? John Ward's going to be our guest next week. John Ward, author of Testimony and chief political correspondent for Yahoo News, all around swell fellow, should be with us next week. But this week, you saw, it's interesting. The New York Times has prompted quite a bit for you this week.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about this. We love Jessica Groves.
Yeah.
We love.
Great journalist.
Love her. I think she's doing a wonderful job. And I think we've on the Substack, we flagged that she was going to be writing about faith in America quite a bit. She's an interesting backstory, interesting interest in religion.
Yep.
And, I think so often these conversations get stuck in a rut. Mm-hmm. I think she's going to bring a fresh voice to it, and she's already doing that. And she wrote an article this week on Christianity's brand problem. We'll talk about that. But first, Melissa, just yesterday you published an article on the Substack, whereweare.substack.com, that you were inspired to write. Mothering talk is in the air. So we won't talk too long about it. I would urge folks to read it, but just give folks the overview of what you wrote, why you wrote it.
Yeah, so there was an op-ed the past few days from a doctor in the op-ed section of the New York Times talking about how even being a doctor in, sort of serious or, anxiety-inducing situations, that motherhood has thrown her for a loop. And I think a lot of people who have mothered children feel that way. And she relates it back to how her baby is like 3 or 4 months old, and she's been struggling with breastfeeding and feeling really guilty and inadequate, sort of depression resulting from that. And I really related with that because I too struggled with breastfeeding with both kids. And the second time around, I actually didn't even faff about with it because I knew that biologically I just could not do it. And so I remember just sort of being so sad that I couldn't when it was happening. And at that time, after I got through the whole haze of like the immediate postpartum, your hormones are fluctuating a ton and all that, I realized, why is it that a biological factor is affecting the way I view myself as a mother so much? And then reading, someone's account again, and I hear these stories all the time about these various things about motherhood. We have a lot of societal expectations around motherhood that we sometimes talk about. A lot of them are implicit. And then motherhood has sort of turned into a brand because we've commodified motherhood in a lot of ways, and therefore it's setting more layers of expectations for us in, the year 2023. We've got mommy influencers. I mean, that's what we call them. And I mean, even calling people mommy influencers or formally calling them mommy bloggers in and of itself, I think is like a sort of derogatory term, which is just so interesting to me that we like to deem people who are writers, we call them that in that way. So I just wanted to write about that, about all the expectations of motherhood, and how, for me, the way that I have dealt with it is, and all these conversations around like, finding your own identity as a mom, and, you're not just a mom, you don't have to lose yourself sort of thing. And I've sort of I feel like I've created my own path, but then I've already heard a bunch of responses from fellow moms saying, I actually feel this exact same way, and I just haven't seen it articulated by someone, that they too are also creating their own paths, that says that mothering is just one part of their identity, and it's not the only part of our identity. And plus the fact, this whole conversation around identity isn't the end all be all. Our kids are, and the way that we love them is. And so I wanted to write about that just because being a mom in 2023 is very difficult, and we're surrounded by a lot of competing interests, especially competing interests around sort of economically how we make our decisions and the commodification of motherhood. So I hope that listeners will resonate with it.
Yeah, I thought it was a great piece. I thought there was, I enjoyed reading it. And so I do hope folks will check it out at whereweare.substack.com. That's WEAR, we are, just like the podcast, .substack.com. Thanks for writing it.
Yeah.
And happy Mother's Day.
Thanks. Very happy to celebrate it.
Yes, indeed.
Get out of the trenches of tedious tasks like managing order fulfillment and start growing your business with ShipStation. They'll help increase profitability by automating your workflow with their simple, easy-to-use dashboard. With it, you can pretty much do everything you need to quickly and easily. Update order information, print labels, compare rates, optimize shipments, and even set up automatic delivery notifications. And it doesn't matter where you sell. Amazon, Etsy, eBay, Shopify, ShipStation can integrate pretty much anywhere online. Another great thing about ShipStation? They can help reduce costs with industry-leading discounted rates from some of the biggest mail carriers. You might even be able to get up to 89% off USPS and UPS rates. So, make this year your most profitable one yet. Sign up for your free 30-day trial at ShipStation.com and use the code Spotify. That's ShipStation.com with the code Spotify.
Making everyone happy on vacation isn't easy, but you know what is? Going to Aruba. All you have to do is walk out your door to find pristine pools, relaxing white sand beaches, and an island teeming with outdoor activities that'll put a smile on any face. You won't just feel great, you'll all feel great, filled with a calmer, more peaceful vibe that radiates Aruba's warmth. And the best part is, it never fades. That's the Aruba effect. Plan your family trip at Aruba.com.
Okay, let's get to this Jessica Grose article. Set it up for us. What did she write about? What prompted the piece?
So like you said, Jessica is writing more on religion. And so she's starting to ask various experts in the field, and some of them you will recognize when you read the piece. And she surveyed her New York Times readers, asking them, are they religious? Are they not? Do they still attend church? Why or why not? So she's been asking those questions. And she starts off this newsletter piece with a quote from Phil Zuckerman, a professor at Pitzer College, who researches atheism and secularity. And he says Christianity's got a branding problem. And then she herself in the newsletter goes on to say, it is seen by many as the religion of conservative Republican politics. And there are otherwise believing people out there who don't want to be associated with that. And so she goes on and she interviews someone like Ryan Burge, the statistician, who Michael and I, we enjoy his work a lot, asking him about, the various latest polling when it comes to religiosity in America and things like that. And she goes through like the 60s and the 70s, sort of a bit of how evangelicalism has formed itself around a political identity. A lot of the stuff that we talk about a lot, Michael, and I know that if our listeners are thinking about or reading about or talk about themselves. And so at the very end of the newsletter piece, she says, in quote, "The Christian brand problem feels most critical in our current political era because that what nuns are responding to goes beyond what's happening in their own churches. Despite the pop cultural perception, Ryan Burge says it's unusual for Christian clergy to express partisan political views." And then she goes on to say, "So what moderate and liberal Christians are responding to might not be explicit conservative messaging from pastors and priests. Some may feel their fellow congregants have moved so far right that they no longer feel the sense of community that they once did. Many respondents mentioned the prevalence of inflexible standards on topics like same-sex marriage and the role of women in society that were no longer tolerable to them. Rather than staying and fighting and trying to change the minds from the inside, they gave up," end quote. So I read this and I brought it to you, Michael, and I said, it feels like lately, and it's interesting to see it from a New York Times journalist and to see her quoting, academics at the university level. But we've been hearing from Christians and Christian leaders themselves this idea that Christianity has a branding problem. And you and I, Michael, we've had our own private conversations about this kind of thinking and framing and framework. And so we wanted to bring that conversation to you, the audience, our listeners. So, Michael, when you hear Christianity has a branding problem, what do you think?
I think that it misses the point. Mm-hmm. The brand problem of Christianity is secondary to the actual problems it has. Mm-hmm. This is a pretty old conversation. I mean, this was, if you think of Gabe Lyons and David Kinnaman's book Unchristian.
Yeah, that's right.
And when Gabe was sort of starting Q, he was operating off the, Christianity has a brand problem or Christianity has a PR problem. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. My understanding is he's since sort of revised, not that so surely there are perception problems mm-hmm. related to Christianity, like there are perception problems with so many other groups and ideas and that kind of thing. But I am concerned by those who wish to sort of reduce the question down to like, if we only had a better marketing plan, mm-hmm. If we only had a better message. And I just want to say, the message we have is pretty great. Like, I don't think the message
the good news is pretty good.
Yeah, the good news is pretty good. We have the best material, to work with. I think that there's a real one of the things that's happened. Jessica writes about Robert Putnam's and David Campbell's work and talks about the conflation between Christianity as a religion and a certain brand of politics. Mm-hmm. I mean, one thing that we lose, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, is this was being written about. Putnam Campbell's book is before Donald Trump was even on the political scene. these were problems that were emerging of a conflation with a kind of politics that many who are anti-Trump think is like pretty great. And like, you know, there were good things about the Bush years, and there were good things and are good things about the Republican Party. The problem isn't that, oh, there was nothing good to find in the Republican Party, or even you could say the problem wasn't that majority of white evangelical Christians viewed the Republican Party as the clear favorite, the clear home for them. The problem was an allegiance and a sort of narrow-mindedness, in some cases a sycophancy, that transcended merely pulling the lever. It was a cultural equivalence. It was a real comfort with assuming that co-religionists were going to vote in the same way. Mm-hmm. So you know, that is a problem that has, like, perception, if you want to use the term brand, like what the general public thinks of when they think of Christians. I think for some it's, you know, akin to an interest group, or akin to an ideological position, and like that's a problem. But what I want to say is, like, it emerges from somewhere. Yeah. And so, yes, let's think about how we could communicate more clearly. Let's think about what our public posture is. But if we're communicating differently, but the actual practice is the same, that's not going to do us any favors, and it shouldn't. That shouldn't be the way that cultural transformation happens. Just switching up your messaging or putting more money into an advertising campaign.
Mm-hmm. I just think it's kind of funny. I don't know if this would be irony, but you call it, you know, there's a problem with Christian branding, and it's usually, and Jessica Groge, like, she hits the nail on the head of what people are referring to, that Christianity is too associated with a certain type of politics, when it's kind of like, when we talk about branding comes out of either a corporate or ultimately what politicians are using themselves, a technique to get people to think a certain way or behave a certain way. So it's kind of ironic that you would call it a brand problem when that's actually what politics uses to get people to vote in a certain way.
Right. I think that's very astute. Like, part of the problem is people think Christians are just trying to sell something like everybody else. Yeah.
So I don't think you should call a belief system or religion a brand. I think that's just deeply problematic because of what it connotes.
Not for Jessica. I mean, I think Jessica's not a Christian. I think it's a perfectly reasonable piece to write that. But I think
she's getting quotes from academics. So sure,
no,
she's
but I think
on it.
We're talking about when Christians themselves are sort of, we got a real brand problem on our hands.
Yeah, because then what Christians go and do is they go and talk about it. If they talk about it, then other people sort of latch onto that, because as humans, we like to categorize things and give things names so that we could easily sort them better. So calling the problems that we have a branding problem, it's almost faddish to call things brand problems. Like, I call it the brand mother today because of the commodification of motherhood. But there's sort of, like, what it connotes with Christianity is that there's some sort of way to commodify belief or commodify the good news, when that's just sort of antithetical to the good news in the first, you know what I mean?
Well, right. So this is exactly right. One of the things that framing it as a brand problem does is it sets yourself up to, okay, well, what would play better? Mm-hmm. what is my audience going to like more? And you down a very dangerous path when that's what
and yet
doing.
again, many of the critiques of like evangelicalism is that people cherry pick like their Bible verses when you're trying to do this kind of work. You're cherry picking like exactly which parts of the good news to then mark it out. So again, it's very funny the way that some of this sort of way of thinking is acting out, or the logical conclusions of it all.
Yeah, yes, it's really clear that comparatively, public perception in America of Christians is worse now than it was 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. You got the polling.
It used to be like an 80-20 question. If you surveyed the American public, do you think religion is part of the answer to our country's problems? Or is it part of the problem itself? Only vast majority of Americans would say it's part of the solution. Now, they disagree on in what way it was part of the solution, but there was a generally sort of positive view that, like, if we had more of the right kind of Christianity, we'd be in a better place. That is now like a 50-50 question. So half of Americans will say that religion broadly is part of the problem, not part of the answer. On the other hand, Melissa, I'm skeptical of wringing our hands too much about this rather than I think public Christians are too often in the place of responding to, does Christianity have a brand problem? And then we're sort of answering that question. I think we're much better off setting our own terms and talking on our own terms. I was really struck and moved. This week, our friend Colin Hansen, who was a guest on the show, did an interview with Molly Worthen. Molly is an academic, one of the best journalists out there. She's really incredible, has been for a long time. She would urge you to go over to Gospel Coalition, listen to Colin's podcast with Molly. After reporting on Christianity for really decades, Molly committed her life to Jesus at J.D. Greer's church, of all places. She was baptized, and she talks about the Christianity that she saw, the Jesus that she saw, in a way that's really moving from someone. Here's what's moving about it, is that she's written extensively about both the good and the bad in American Christianity. So this is not someone who's been like, her job is cataloging sort of the state of religion in American life. And there's not a negative piece of news about Christians in America that doesn't cross Molly's desk. But she saw to the heart of it. And the fact that that is still happening in 2023 is a beautiful thing, and suggests that things aren't as closed off. The culture is not as antagonistic as some folks who benefit off of this sort of narrative that, Christians can't get heard in the public square anymore. Things are set against us. Things aren't necessarily that closed off as some folks like to suggest.
Yeah, I mean, there's that kind of approach, that kind of mentality that people are benefiting off of. But even just like this idea of self-deprecation disguised as humility when you're talking to folks about Jesus, like, isn't helpful. I know that with the politicization of Christianity in the United States over many decades makes it sometimes hard to separate the two things. But this, again, self-deprecation disguised as humility means that people, when it comes to the good news, it does sort of disguise the good part of the good news for folks. And I think that does matter. And the more that people think that, like, oh, this is just an image problem and the branding problem, the more that people will believe it. And I get it, Michael, like exactly as you said before, that, you know, this shouldn't be like our only focus right now, that we do have some bigger fish to fry. But I did want to talk about it a bit because it seems like it's a conversation that's coming back around again.
Well, so right, and I think maybe we'll close here. What's interesting is Christians have been having this conversation for some time. What was interesting reading the piece was its level of sympathy and the fact that Jessica kind of, in my reading, kind of approaches Christians as a minority group trying to find their place in society. Mm-hmm. Like you could replace so much of this, or at least sort of the framing of the article, with, like, you know, Muslims have a branding problem, or like, and so that's part of why I'm enjoying Jessica's writing. I don't mean to say that she doesn't have deep insight. She does. But the fact that she hasn't been living and breathing in this discourse for the last 20 years, it is really helpful to the tone that she takes. I mean, it is interesting. You read these sort of histories of evangelicalism, and it's funny. The Pulitzer Prize winning author Frances Fitzgerald wrote a book on a huge book on evangelicals and evangelicalism in America. My understanding is she's not an evangelical herself, and yet she brought a more compassionate, a more sort of analytical, a deeper analytical eye than I think a lot of the grousing that folks who at the end of the day would say, I wouldn't know Jesus if it wasn't for my experience in American Christian churches. I wouldn't, my life is richer because of the role that American Christianity, whatever put then, that has had in my life. So that's interesting. Reading it just comes from like a slightly different angle, this article, than someone who is just trying to advocate for their particular brand of Christianity. Jessica doesn't have necessarily. She talks about why she's interested in, and as a citizen, as a person with Christian friends, etc. Like, I don't mean like she doesn't have a stake, but she's not wearing a particular jersey in the intramural, Christian debates, which is helpful for a piece like this. Yeah,
completely agree.
All right, well, that I think is all that we have for you this week. We got through the episode without talking about what happened on CNN on Wednesday night. So, I mean, I think you should pat us on the back for that.
Thank you.
Well, more like you're welcome. You're welcome.
That too.
And so, but
keeping the blood pressure down.
We will have John Ward as a guest. I'm sure we'll talk about 2024 a bit with John.
Yes.
As well as his book, Testimony. We have other exciting guests coming up in coming weeks. But as always, thank you for listening. Hope you have a wonderful Mother's Day. We'll be with you for the Morning Five throughout the week. And again, we'll be with John Ward next weekend. You've been listening to Where We Are.
Bye.
the weekend, but I still wanna turn up. Yeah, I still wanna